everybody, and welcome to OBooks Presents. OBooks is, we publish books for spiritual living, and we're the main flagship imprint for the Mind, Body, Spirit section of books in John Hunt Publishing. And today we're really happy to interview one of our fantastic authors, Steve Taylor, and ask him a few questions about spiritual awakening. Now, Steve Taylor is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spiritual awakening, including three with us, books, The Fool, where he talks about evidence for a golden age 6,000 years ago, the birth of the ego and the dawning of a new era, The Meaning, which is poetic and spiritual reflections, and I, Not Other Than I, co-written with spiritual teacher Russell Williams. In the last 4 years, he's been included in Mind, Body, Spirit magazine's most spiritually influential living people. His books have been published in 19 languages, while his articles and essays have been published in over 40 academic journals, magazines, and newspapers. Eckhart Tolle has described his work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet as present. Welcome, Steve, and hello.
Hi, Ben. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. I'm going to launch straight into it. One of the things we'd like to do on this channel is talk about spiritual concepts and ideas and try and make them simple and accessible. I said in the intro, you've written a lot about psychology and spiritual awakening. So I wondered if I could ask you, what is spiritual awakening, and maybe you could explain it in terms for someone who might be understanding it for the first time.
Okay, well, I don't think there's anything particularly esoteric or extraordinary about spiritual awakening. And I think there are probably a lot more spiritually awakened people around than we realize. So I think of spiritual awakening as a more expansive state of being. It's a state in which we become more aware of the world around us, we become more perceptually aware, so that the world becomes a more vivid and real place, and we have a sense of wonder and a sense of appreciation. And also we have a wider sense of perspective. You know, we don't just think of ourselves as belonging to a certain nation or a certain group or a certain ethnic identity. We feel that we are connected to the whole human race. We have a very all-embracing sense of identity. And also we have inwardly we have a sense of stillness, a sense of well-being, and our minds are not particularly busy. And also, if thoughts run through our minds, we tend to not to identify with them. We're aware that thoughts are just a process, and emotions are just a process that runs through us. And we don't tend to identify with our thoughts, and our state of being, or our mood, is not determined by the content of our thoughts. And in terms of the way we live, spiritually awakened people tend not to live an accumulative lifestyle. They tend to be they tend to live a contributing lifestyle. They contribute rather than accumulate. So they're very altruistic. They have a sense of mission. They have a desire to contribute to society, to the whole human race. And often they have a sense of mission.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm interested in the idea of not identifying with your thoughts. Can you explain the difference between maybe how someone would identify with their thoughts and how, if they're a bit more spiritually awake, how that would change?
If somebody is in a kind of more mundane state of consciousness, or in a sleep state, as I call it, their mood tends to be determined by the content of their thoughts. So if they think, maybe they think about an event in the future, which they're not looking forward to, and immediately their mood becomes a little down, a bit depressed because of this event in the future. Or maybe they think about the past, and they think about a negative event from the past, and immediately they feel a bit of guilt, they feel guilty, maybe they feel bitterness, resentment, and so forth. But in the spiritually awakened state, you're aware that thoughts are just a process, almost like a physiological process, like digestion or circulation, blood circulation. It's just a kind of automatic, involuntary process. So maybe you do think about an event in the future, but you think, oh well, that's just my thought process. I don't have to believe these thoughts. I don't have to let them take me away. I can ignore them if I want to. So your mood does not become determined by your thoughts. So if you think about the past, you're free to disregard any negative thoughts, and You can just think of, in the same way that if you're watching TV, and if the TV program becomes boring, you can just turn your attention away and, give your attention to your surroundings or read a book. And it's the same with your thoughts. You're free to allow them to pass by without identifying with them.
So you're spending less time thinking about the past and feeling emotional about the past, and less time thinking about the future and feeling emotional about the future, and enjoying being in the present more.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about spiritual awakening is that it makes the present seem very real. The present becomes the center of our lives. We become aware that the future and the past don't really exist. They're just abstractions. The future is just an idea in our heads, and the past is just memories. It's just memories and recording of events from the past, but neither of them really exist. So, we become very aware of that when we're spiritually awakened, and we give our whole attention to the present tense. A bit like children. Children give the whole of their attention to their present experience. So they're completely absorbed and immersed in their present experience. So we do that in the spiritually awakened state too.
This sounds great. And if I was listening to this and saying, "Oh, I'm spending so much time worrying about this thing I have to do tomorrow," or "I'm spending all my time fixating on something which really annoyed me and has affected my life," how do I wake up? How do people wake up? How do people become spiritually awakened?
Well, it can be a long process. It can take years, decades. But I think everybody can gain a little inkling of it any moment. If you're in a state of abstraction, if your mind is busy with thoughts about the future and the past, all you really need to do is to bring your attention right back into the present moment. So you may be in the kitchen, you may be making breakfast or washing the dishes, and you become aware that your attention is focused on what happened yesterday or what's going to happen later today. So if you become aware of that, you can bring your attention right back into your present experience. So you can become aware of the sensation of washing the dishes, the reflections of light on the water, the bubbles in the water, the sensation of touching the plates. Or you can become aware of the food you're eating. You can give your attention to the sensation of eating, the sensation of swallowing, the flavors of the food. And when you do that, you gain a little inkling of what it means to be spiritually awakened. Your present experience becomes very real, and you become aware of the stillness and the well-being which exists in the present moment when our minds become quiet.
Yeah, so bringing your attention, whatever you're doing, bringing your attention back to this moment, and the senses you're feeling, and the textures and colours and smells and the immediate present reality is what you're saying.
That's right, yeah. And it's almost a sense of creating space within your own being. When our minds are busy with thought chatter, when there's this endless stream of associations running through our minds, we become very cluttered up inside. There's no space within us, but all it takes is for us to give our attention to the present moment, or maybe we can do that by meditating. It creates a space inside us, and we can travel through that space into the depths of our own being.
You mentioned meditating. Now, I think meditating is one of the main ways people practice waking up or practice becoming spiritually awakened. Do you recommend any one particular practice, or what are your views on these kind of what people call practices?
Well, I think the meditation, as you say, it's probably, every spiritual tradition in history has developed some form of meditation. It's probably the most common and the most essential spiritual practice. Meditation brings us closer to awakening in so many different ways. It softens the boundary between us and the world. It quietens our minds so that we can journey deeper into ourselves. But I think the main reason why meditation is so effective is because it enables us to transcend the seeming separateness of our egos. It enables us to transcend the illusion that we are separate beings living in duality with the world. And I think one of the good things about living in the contemporary world is that there are so many different forms of meditation for us to explore. You know, if I'd been born 100 years ago, maybe, you know, if I'd known about meditation at all, maybe it had been some kind of Christian meditation, maybe from the Eastern Orthodox Church. But now, in the 21st century, you know, there are so many different types of meditation, from Buddhism, Taoism, the Kabbalah, Sufism, and so forth. And, you know, and every single person, we have different personality traits, we have different preferences. So I think different meditation techniques work best for different people. So, you know, I think you should play around and try out different techniques and find one, or maybe more than one, which works best for you.
Brilliant. In a way, there's never been a better time to get into meditation.
Yeah.
You mentioned techniques from various traditions, like Sufism or Christian meditation. Do you have to be religious or connected to a religion to spiritually awaken, or what's the role of religions in doing this, and what are your feelings on that?
I don't think you need to be religious at all. I don't think you need to be spiritual, in a sense. I don't think you need to belong to any religious tradition, even any spiritual tradition. I mean, I've done a lot of research in my role as a psychologist about spiritual awakening, about the different situations where people become spiritually awakened, or even when people have temporary spiritual experiences. And I've always found that by far the majority of awakenings or awakening experiences occur outside spiritual traditions or religious traditions. So spiritual awakening usually occurs to people who don't know anything about spiritual traditions or spiritual practices. It occurs very accidentally, often in the midst of intense psychological turmoil. So most people become suddenly or dramatically awakened, maybe following a diagnosis of cancer, following a bereavement, following a period of intense depression or stress, following major life upheavals. And they don't know anything about spiritual traditions. Maybe later on, when they try to understand what's happened to them, then they find out about those traditions. But I mean, I think spiritual traditions, they give people a framework which they can use to become awakened, but you don't necessarily have to use that framework.
I see, yep. And you talk about often that an awakening experience might be triggered by psychological turmoil. I know a lot of us in the West, we grow up maybe consciously or unconsciously thinking that life is hard, life is tragic, like painful things happen, and you say sometimes, you know, this experience can almost completely turn around into a completely different perspective, where life feels more harmonious and life feels intrinsically good, how does that happen? How can we suddenly go from thinking things are awful to things are wonderful?
Yeah, it's very paradoxical. I mean, most spiritual experiences occur when people are in states of extreme despair or turmoil, and suddenly there's this shift around where the turmoil and despair fade away, and suddenly people are filled with a sense of joy and a sense of meaning and oneness. So it's quite paradoxical. And long-term spiritual awakenings often occur in the same way. People's sense of self often seems to break down completely because of the turmoil they go through. A good example is I've spoken to a few addicts, drug or alcohol addicts, who lost everything due to their addiction. You know, they lost their friends, they lost their families, their wives, children, their businesses. And it was usually when they'd lost everything that the transformation occurred. Usually at a moment of acceptance or a moment of surrender or handing over their problem. That was when something new seemed to be born inside them. And it was almost as if the normal ego or the normal identity was broken down completely by the suffering and by the loss they'd been through. And once the normal self is broken down and collapses, a bit like a building collapses when all the bricks are taken away, at a certain point it just caves in and collapses. When that happens, for some people it's almost as if there is a latent higher self which is waiting to be born inside them. So when the old self collapses, this latent higher self suddenly emerges, a bit like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, and it takes over and it becomes their normal identity. So it's like the birth of a new self.
That's beautiful. And so for the normal or more mundane sense of self, it might be characterized by saying, sort of, I am nothing without my job. My job needs to be going well for me to be happy. Or as long as my relationship is going well, or I have X amount of money in the bank, I need these things to be happy, and then, or to feel like I'm me. And then all that can be taken away suddenly or painfully, and you realize that there's a kind of me underneath there which isn't connected to those things. Is that part of it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think in a normal state of consciousness, in the sleep state, people do tend to derive their sense of identity and their sense of well-being from external things. So you think you're an important person because you're wealthy, because you're successful, or at least you try to be wealthy and successful so that you can become important. And yeah, your ego, these things are all the building blocks of the ego. They create our sense of identity, our sense of being significant or important people. But when people go through intense turmoil, all of these things are taken away. So all of these building blocks are withdrawn. So you lose for example, if you're diagnosed with cancer and told that you only have 1 year left to live, then your future ambitions, your goals are taken away. Your success and wealth are basically taken away. They're threatened because of death. And everything which you depend on for your well-being is taken away. And for some people, that leads to a tremendous sense of anxiety, a tremendous sense of loss and despair. But for other people, it enables that new self to be born inside them. It enables them to find an inner well-being. And I think when that happens, we realize that there is an inner wholeness and an inner well-being which doesn't depend on anything external. It just exists naturally in a state of well-being and wholeness. And when we find that, we don't need anything. We don't need any wealth. We don't need any success. We don't need any sense of being significant or important. We just experience the natural well-being and wholeness of being itself.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of one or two people I know who have been through exactly those things: loss of money and cancer. And I wouldn't call them overtly religious or inverted commas spiritual, but they are some of the happiest people I know, and who've come out and enjoy life. In your book with us called The Fall, which came out in 2005, and we hope soon we'll do a new edition of it. That's in the works. You say we haven't always been spiritually asleep necessarily, and you talk about a long time ago when this state of awakening was perhaps normal, and somehow we fell asleep. How did we fall asleep? Why did the human race become like this?
Wow. Well, that's a big question. But what I suggest in The Fall is that about 6,000 years ago, certain groups of human beings began to experience a psychological change. So before then, people that had a sense of identity, they had a sense of being, conscious human beings living in the world, but they didn't really have a sense of separation. People experienced a sense of communion with nature, a sense of communion with other human beings, the members of their groups. And so they didn't really have a sense of being individuals, being separate individuals. And that's why, there's a lot of evidence that early human groups were very egalitarian, very peaceful, and also non-theistic. Early human beings did not have gods in the sense we understand the term. They were aware of a spiritual force which pervaded their surroundings, and they were aware of spirits, but spirits were not gods. Spirits are, maybe forces, non-physical forces which permeated the world. So about 6,000 years ago, people began to change. People began to develop a sense of separateness. They began to feel that they were separate individuals living in duality with nature, in duality with their own bodies even, and also within members of their own group. People became suddenly individuated. So I call that the ego explosion. People, the ego suddenly became a lot stronger within people. Only when there's certain groups of people, for example, the group that's known as the Indo-Europeans, which originated in Central Asia and the Middle East. And these groups, they became the first warlike human beings, the first kind of intensively warlike human beings. They became the first patriarchal societies. And they also developed the first theistic religions, the first hierarchical societies. And all of this came about as a side effect of this new strong sense of ego, this new sense of separateness, this new sense of duality. But these groups were they were also quite technologically advanced. That was the kind of the positive side of the ego, if you like. It led to lots of new technological advances. So they became very, very powerful, very dominant, and they spread over Europe, over the Middle East, and into Asia. And they eventually became, dominant throughout the whole world, as they are nowadays.
And I think do you suggest that perhaps the ego was strengthened, became stronger in this way due to harsher living conditions? Is that right? And more competition for resources?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I suggest that there were potentially environmental factors which led to this change. I mean, something obviously happened because there's a lot of evidence that these certain groups in the Middle East and Central Asia, that they, at the same time as undergoing these new cultural changes, at the same time as warfare developed, at the same time as patriarchy and hierarchical societies developed, there were environmental changes. Large areas of the Middle East and Central Asia became desiccated. They became much more arid. So it became much more difficult to survive in those areas. So my suggestion is that the new ego developed as a way or in response to these difficult conditions. And
you also suggest that there's the silver lining, if you like, is perhaps the intense technological advancements that have come of that time. But you also talk about a new era starting, the need for us to wake up collectively more as a whole, perhaps against the background of being destructive to the world, such as global warming. Do you think that is happening today, and do you think the two are connected somehow?
I think it is happening. For the last 6,000 years, we've been living in the shadow of the fall. And we've been slowly but surely destroying the environment, destroying each other. We've been living under catastrophic conditions of intense warfare for the last 6,000 years. We've been living in societies where women have been dominated and oppressed, and where small groups of powerful people have oppressed the majority of people. And, we've been abusing and exploiting the world's natural resources. And all of this has come from what I call the overdeveloped ego. This strong, separate, dualistic ego. So, we can't continue for much longer. The end point of the ego explosion is self-destruction. And that's beginning to happen already. Millions of species are being destroyed. The world's natural resources are being massively depleted. And we're suffering, major, potentially catastrophic environmental problems. But on the positive side, I think over the last 300 years, we've been undergoing a change. I call this the transfall era. So we've got the pre-fall era, which is before 6,000 years ago, before 4,000 BC, the fallen era, which has been the last 6,000 years, and the transfall era, which is just beginning, which has just begun over the last 300 years. And the transfall era is a movement beyond the fallen ego. It's a movement beyond the separateness of the ego. And so if you look back over the last 300 years, you see a movement towards increasing compassion, increasing egalitarianism, increasing democracy, which has happened all over Europe and in many other countries. You see increasingly better treatment of animals. You see better treatment towards marginalized groups in society. And it's by no means perfect. The process is still underway. But, compared to 300 years ago, there have been major significant changes. And over the last few decades, there's been this amazing upsurge in interest in spiritual traditions and self-development. That's probably one of the strongest signs of the transform era.
Fantastic. And one of the compelling ideas in the book that you suggest is that maybe war, which we all think is kind of normal, that's why we have to have tons of weapons stockpiled, is actually fundamentally not so natural to us, and that there might be evidence for that as well.
There's a lot of evidence that early human beings were not warlike. Warfare became endemic beginning around 4,000 years ago, but there's almost no evidence for prehistoric warfare. I think many evolutionary psychologists, sort of neo-Darwinists, like to picture war as a natural human condition. They see life as basically competitive. It's a battle for survival between different groups, a battle for resources. But as I say, I think it's generally accepted by most anthropologists and archaeologists that warfare is a late development in human history. Early human groups were not warlike, and even the contemporary human groups who live the same lifestyle as early human beings, like contemporary hunter-gatherer groups who live a lifestyle where they basically take what they need and they don't store resources, they don't live settled lifestyles. Those groups are also, even in the contemporary world, they're still egalitarian and peaceful. There was a recent study from a few years ago, a study of, I think it was 21 contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, and there was only one which had, significant signs of violent behavior over the last few decades. So there were very few, if any, murders in those groups. So warfare, I think even now that's probably it's probably becoming now the conventional viewpoint that war is a late development in human history.
And this idea of taking what you need, would you say spiritual awakening is characterized by less overconsumption? You less feel the need, you feel the need less to eat more, buy more, have more, and you tend to consume things that you genuinely need. And actually, as though we have to do that as a whole planet right now.
That's one of the major changes which people undergo when they become spiritually awakened. So I think, as I mentioned before, they become less interested in accumulating things, and they shift towards contribution rather than accumulation. And that goes back to the ego. When you become spiritually awakened, you don't need to support your ego by gaining things. You don't need to support a fragile, separate sense of ego by accumulating possessions, by gaining power or status. You don't need any of those things because you exist in a natural sense of wholeness, a natural sense of well-being. So there's no need to accumulate anything. You don't need anything. You exist in wholeness already. So when people undergo awakening, on the one hand, they have no need to accumulate things which they don't need. And on the other hand, they have a very global sense of outlook, a very global outlook, and also a sense of responsibility to the whole human race. They're no longer self-centered in the same way that they're no longer self-seeking. So they do become very conscious of the need to sort of reduce their consumption and to live a simple lifestyle. They become more environmentally conscious, and at the same time they have a stronger need to contribute to the world.
Yeah. And I'm just going to ask you, this is all fascinating and great. What are you up to at the moment, and what are as a writer and spiritual author, what are you up to at the moment, and what are your plans for the future at the moment?
Well, my new book, The Leap, was published 3 months ago. Yeah. So I'm still a little bit busy with that. I'm still doing some interviews and writing some articles about that. But I'm planning a new book, which is a slight departure for me. It's a book about science. It's maybe going to be called Spiritual Science, and it's going to be an attempt to reconcile spirituality and science, because sometimes they're seen as rivals or opposites. But I think there's no reason why science cannot be spiritual, and there's no reason why spirituality can't be scientific. So that's my next project.
Fantastic. And if people want to find out more about you, see your full range of books, and get more involved, where can they find you?
Well, my website is the best place to go. It's stephenmtaylor.com. Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. So I've got many articles and many poems on my website, and also I run online courses, so there's information about that as well.
Fantastic. And we talked at the beginning about things we can do to help us awaken, and we can bring our attention into the present moment. We can experiment and practice with meditation practices. But I'd like to talk about your poems and spiritual reflections briefly, because I think reading and listening to these poems are also a way of meditating and waking up. And you published a series, a group of them with us, called The Meaning, and I wondered if you would like to comment on them and share one or two for us.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I think there's a close connection between spirituality and poetry, and many of the greatest poets in history, in English literature or American literature, were spiritually awakened individuals, like William Wordsworth or Walt Whitman or D.H. Lawrence. And many of the greatest spiritual teachers in history were also poets. Many of the greatest spiritual figures in history, like Rumi, Hafiz, and many others. So there's this close connection. I think when you experience spiritual states of being, then often it's difficult to describe them in ordinary language, because they transcend the duality of ordinary language. So poetry seems a natural way of trying to depict those experiences, because poetry isn't limited by the normal conventions of language. So my own poems, they are really expressions of my own spiritual experiences. I read one called The Alchemy of Attention from The Meaning.
Fantastic.
And this is actually a good description of what we were talking about earlier, about how you can bring your attention into the present moment. And when you do that, the world becomes a different place. Your surroundings become illuminated and animated. So this is the alchemy of attention. When a mist of multiplying thoughts fills your mind, associations spinning endlessly, images jostling and memories whirling, free falling through your inner space, you can always bring your attention back to now. This morning, making breakfast for the kids, I catch myself daydreaming, and with a gentle mental nudge, I remind myself of where I am. And straight away, the kitchen clutter turns to spacious presence. A mosaic of sunlit squares across the floor, fading and brightening with the passing clouds. The metal rims of stools firing sparks. Steam curls floating over cups, reflecting silver spoons. The perfect stillness of spilt coffee grains. The gaudy yellow and blue of detergent bottles, and the window smudges exposed by sun. Everything perfectly still and real. Everything perfectly itself. Attention is an alchemy that turns dullness to beauty and anxiety to ease.
That's beautiful.
Thanks. I read one more. which is called What You Need. And I'll read this because it also relates to what we were talking about earlier, about how we assume that we need external things to keep us happy and to give us identity. But in reality, we don't need anything. We only need to uncover the wholeness, the innate wholeness and well-being within us. So this is what you need. You don't need anyone to remind you that you exist, to tell you that you're important, to treat you with respect, to bolster your fragile self-esteem and disappoint you when they don't. You don't need daily doses of good news to lift your mood when you feel glum. You don't need compliments or presents or flirtatious smiles across the room to keep you happy with yourself, or hourly fixes of pleasure to set your brain cells jingling and frustrate you when they don't. You don't need to surround yourself with luxury to treat yourself to the best of everything. Metallic fridges and designer bags, the colours of the season, the cars of the year, to show others that you're special and feel incomplete when you can't. You don't need to cover up the silence with the chatter of radios and TVs. You don't need to fill the empty space with jobs that don't need doing, or words that have no meaning, or tasks that have no purpose except to fill the empty space. You don't need to occupy your mind with activities and distractions to keep your attention outside yourself and feel naked when you can't. You only need to meet yourself. So let the discord fade away and find the stillness underneath, the place where you're already whole, where there is no need to seek or strive because there is no need.
Lovely. And I think we can all, what I'm struck by is that exactly what you said about poetry is that those poems very pithily get to the essence of what we talked about at the beginning. They kind of get straight to the point in a way that only a poem can.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah, that's true.
And also it's another way of practicing waking up, isn't it? To read a poem like yours just in 10 seconds or 30 seconds and have a moment of reflection afterwards.
Yeah, it can be a kind of meditation.
Yeah. I think as we're here, we should mention Russell and I Not Other Than I quickly. One of your other books with us was co-written or written with a man called Russell Williams. That's right, isn't it? And he's quite old now. He's in his 90s, and he's
96.
I guess you could call him as a kind of spiritual teacher in Manchester, and it's called I Not Other Than I, and it's a mixture of his life story and his wisdom, really. And I know in the book that he had some very difficult personal challenges himself, but also had an intense sense of lack of fear and safety. So I wondered if you could quickly talk about Russell, how you came to write the book, a tiny bit about his personal journey and what he has to say.
Russell had a very traumatic and very tragic early life. He was born in 1921, and he was an orphan by the age of 11 or 12. Both his parents died, and he'd already left school by that time because at the age of 11 he left school to try and support his mother after his father died. But his mother died within a year after he left school. So for years he did very difficult, mundane jobs for low pay. It was very difficult for him to survive. And then the war broke out when he was 18, and that was very traumatic. Obviously, he was in London. He lived through the Blitz in London. He was at Dunkirk. He's one of the people in Dunkirk who helped to ferry people to safety. So he speaks about that in the book, about how traumatic it was being at Dunkirk. And after the war, he was completely broken down. He felt emotionally and physically wrecked by his early traumatic experiences and his wartime experiences. So he became a kind of tramp. He didn't want to do anything. He became a kind of tramp and wandered around for months. And eventually he joined a traveling circus. And his job was to look after the horses, to groom the horses, to dress them, and so forth. So he'd sleep in the stables with the horses and spend his whole days with them. So that went on for 3 years. He lived with the horses for 3 years as a groom. And one morning, after those 3 years, he woke up and realized that something had changed. He looked over at the horses and realized that he was not separate from them. He realized that he was the horses. He was looking outside from the horses' eyes, through the horses' eyes. And wherever he looked at other animals, and he felt the same, that he was inside them looking out. And when he looked at human beings, he felt the same, that he was inside them. And he also realized that his mind was quiet. He wasn't thinking anymore. And he felt like a completely different person. And obviously this was in 1950, I think. So he didn't know anything about spiritual awakening. Nobody else did. Very few people in England at that time knew about spiritual practices or traditions. So for several years he lived in a state of confusion. He did look on this shift. He felt different. He was no longer separate. But nobody could understand it, and he didn't understand it either. So he began to feel a bit frustrated because he couldn't understand. He thought maybe he'd gone crazy, and other people told him that he'd gone crazy. But the thing is, in the late 1950s, he underwent another shift where all of his frustration dissolved away, and he happened to meet a Buddhist in London who could make him understand, who could explain the changes he'd gone through. And he was adopted by a Buddhist society in London as a teacher, as an enlightened person, a kind of naturally enlightened person. So ever since then, ever since 1959, he has been a spiritual teacher. Very quietly, very few people have known about him. And I was lucky that about 20 years ago, I was a member of a Gurdjieff group in Manchester. And another member of the group told me about Russell and invited me along to one of the meetings. And Russell, he's never promoted himself or sought any publicity or never tried to draw attention to himself. He's just been content working with small groups of people. And initially, about 10 years ago, I asked him if he was interested in writing a book, and he said, no, maybe when I'm dead, you can write a book. But I'm happy just working with small groups of people. But about 5 years ago, he had a health scare, and so he thought he may not be around for much longer. So he told me that now was a time when he'd like to start working on a book. Unfortunately, the health scare passed. He returned to good health. So we published the book 2 years ago, and it's been very successful, and a lot of new people have been coming along to Russell's meetings, and he's just about to turn 96, but he's in good health, and he's still holding meetings twice a week in Manchester.
Fantastic, and it is a brilliant book because not only because Russell has a lot of value to say, but also I think it's so valuable. His story is so incredible, and he went through much more extreme situations than most of us will ever come close to, and there's so much power in that transformation. It's valuable and comforting and inspiring for all of us, I think.
Yeah, he's a fantastic example of how intense trauma and turmoil can lead to spiritual awakening. I think in conjunction with the 3 years he spent working with the horses, I think that was a kind of spiritual practice. It was a practice of service and constant mindfulness. So I think that spiritual practice unlocked the transformational power of the turmoil he'd been through.
Yeah. And do you think, just to finish off, you mentioned, he had a very profound transformation and struggled to make sense of it and thought, maybe, am I crazy? I think we might be closer now, but do you think there's a need for mainstream psychology or mainstream culture to incorporate spiritual awakening? Do you think that would be valuable rather than potentially lock someone up or something if they have this extreme change?
It's still a problem. I think things have got better since Russell's time. But still, in my new book, The Leap, I talk about several cases of people who underwent spiritual awakening, and they didn't understand it themselves at the time. They tried to explain it to other people and only faced incomprehension. And they ended up in psychiatric hospitals or being given psychiatric medication, which wasn't helpful at all. Luckily they had a strong sense that they were undergoing a spiritual transformation, even though they didn't really know what spirituality was. They knew that they were undergoing some significant process, some significant transformation. So they had trust in themselves, and they did manage to get off medication and leave psychiatric hospitals. But it's still a problem. Most psychiatrists do not understand spiritual awakening, and they just interpret it as psychosis. And it's tricky because when spiritual awakening happens very suddenly, it can be very explosive, and it can cause disruption to the mind and to the body, and it can produce, seemingly psychotic characteristics. So, you have to be aware as a psychiatrist that there is a phenomenon which we call spiritual awakening, and many people who seem to have psychotic symptoms are actually undergoing a very profound and positive transformation experience.
Yeah. I also find, to round off, I think we've covered some really great points today, and I think one important one is spiritual awakening can happen separate from religion, but you can be drawn to religion to help you understand and process this. But a lot of people, and I certainly was grown up in this climate of religion is the root of all conflict, religion is the root of all war, and actually what we're implying in our discussion today is that ideally religions developed to facilitate the same thing, really, same kind of ultimate aim, ultimately, despite lots of differences on the surface, to facilitate this inner transformation and help people do it.
It depends on what you mean by religion, really. I mean, there are so many different forms of religion. I think fundamentalist religion is not spiritual at all. It's just it's a way of supporting the ego. That's all it is. It's a way of providing consolation and support for the ego. But there's also spiritual religion or mystical religion, which is completely different, and we have many Christian mystics, many Jewish and Sufi Islamic mystics who really have more in common with each other than they do with their own religions, So religion, spiritual religion, is wonderful, and it is transformative, and every religion has that tradition. So in that sense, spiritual traditions which are affiliated with Hinduism or Christianity or Sufism or Judaism, they do have a very important role to play.
Fantastic, Steve. Thank you. I could go on, but we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and all the best with the latest books, and thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed it.